around the world, in Babel women, Haitian women, and others. And so, yeah, too much more. I will hand over the mic to what you're all here for. Yeah, here's a round of applause for Maria.
Okay, so good morning, almost afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. It's a great space, and I feel very happy to see all the posters and the activism. I feel very comfortable in spaces like this. And I'm very honored to be here to speak about this topic, which is, of course, something I'm passionate about. It has to do with my work. As Danny said, I'm a translator, a professional translator and mainly interpreter. I imagine, do you understand the difference between the two activities? Because sometimes people are not very clear. So translation is the written version, and interpreting is the spoken version. So I do both things, and they're also not just my job, but also a political approach to language. But anyway, we'll come to that a bit later. First of all, I have to start by explaining, in the spirit of situated knowledge, or as Brazilian feminist theoretician Jamila Ribeiro claims, lugar da fala, so the place of enunciation or the place of speech. I always like to first explain a bit of where I'm from. I don't take for granted that people are going to know where Galicia is and what that means. So I brought a small map, and Galicia is in the northwest of Spain. This is Portugal down here. But maybe geography is not as important as the understanding of our community through language. And I many times say that Galician, as a Galician identity, is a kind of a hinge position. Because on the one hand, we are a non-hegemonic identity because of the language. Our language is not, well, there are many ways to explain why it's not non-hegemonic, but of course, we can start by the educational system. Galician speakers do not have access to an education in their own language, and there are many rules within the Spanish state that makes us a peripheral, marginalized community. And I'm using the term hegemony here in the sense that Gramsci does. Of course, he comes from Marxism, and he speaks about a class, but in my case, we're going to speak about a group that exercises political, intellectual, and moral role of leadership within a hegemonic system, that is, people who have the power. As I was saying, so the Galician language community is on the one hand a non-hegemonic community because of the situation of the language, but at the same time it's also a European, mainly white community. So we're at the intersection between those two aspects, which makes our position quite interesting for the purpose of analyzing power. And of course, I'm sure you've heard the term intersectionality at some point. Have you? Yeah. So I think that anybody who has some awareness of the kind of world we live in will realize that the general hegemony is defined by being white, heterosexual, cisgender, anglophone, and male, right? So this is something I think all of us in this room already understand, and there's no need to explain this further. But there is another type of hegemony, and this also goes into those movements that are there to fight for the rights of people who are trying to introduce change in society. One of them is feminism, or feminisms in the plural, and I'm going to be discussing this in a minute. But first I wanted to engage you in a very short exercise and ask you, so if you look at these faces, how many could tell the names of the, 6 women that we have here? No? Nobody? You can raise your hand. What about, let's say, 3? Do you know 3 of these women? Yeah? Who does know 3? Nobody? 1? I'm sure you can give me 1 name. Yeah. So this is Virginia Woolf. We're used to seeing her, I think. Especially people who are in literature, they're familiar with her. Do you know anybody else? Yeah? Of the Lord. Okay, so sometimes we're not familiar with the faces, but maybe we know the names. So this is like uncovering who they are. So we spoke about intersectionality. Well, we had Kimberly Crenshaw, who is actually the woman who developed the term. We had different names. Some of them might be now familiar, but we didn't know their faces. And this is like, we could go through the same exercise here, for example. Do we know any of these women by name or face, now that you have both? Yeah? Which ones do you know?
Berta.
Mm-hmm.
Don't remember what country, but she's like a environmental activist in South America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was murdered, unfortunately. Right. Anybody else? Do you know any of these women? Yeah.
Gloria and
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we could move out of the continent, of the American continent, and we would have other faces. Anyone rings a bell here? By name or face? No? Nobody? Okay. Yeah. So I just feel that because Robert is the post-colonial critic. Philosopher. And, you know, in other continents, other faces, other names. So what we can see through this very brief exercise is that to some point, so we were familiar with some of these activists, theoreticians, authors, and not with others. One of the reasons is because many of these authors that we were just looking at, theoreticians, they do not write in English. So whenever we're discussing feminism, there's a type of hegemony we tend to forget, which has to do with language. And this is what I will be discussing now in the coming minutes. And I always use this metaphor of language as a funnel, as a epistemological funnel, because whenever we speak a language, it's like seeing through the narrow part. If we only speak one language, we're looking at the world through the narrow part of the funnel. So the problem is that the hegemonic community, and nowadays in the world, English is the language of the hegemony, is not aware of the funnel. So this is what makes this particular aspect problematic. It's not just that, of course, if a person is monolingual in any language, they're only looking at the world through one funnel. But most of us, if I think about Galician monolinguals, there aren't many, because most of us are bilingual in Galician and Spanish. But we are aware of the fact that our language is just one of the many ways of seeing the world. But when the language is a hegemonic language, then the speakers think that this is the way to see the world. And I wanted to go back to colonialism to explain language hegemony, because many times we forget that this idea of a monolingual space is something that was introduced through colonization. And particularly if we look at the history of the Americas before the invasion and before colonization, we know that there were different languages in this very vast continent. But there was no goal of a monolingual language that had to be spoken by everyone. And actually, now if we go into my profession and the history of interpreting, we know that many of the interpreters back in the day, most of them were women. And I'm sure you have heard of maybe Malinche, if anybody has Mexican roots. It's a very well-known and popular figure. Pocahontas, of course, thanks to Disney, we all heard about her. Or Krutoa. In the colonial narrative, they became the lovers of the colonizer, or, you know, there are so many stories about them. But in fact, some scholars in interpreting studies realized that these women were diplomats, and this was the usual role of women in the Americas before colonization. So we can say that the idea that we now strive for a language like English is the language of international communication, and you know everybody should speak English to talk to one another, is actually, that goal was introduced through colonization. And I have to add that we were speaking about the Spanish colonizers. They had already tested the theories in our own territory because they were trying to impose Spanish as the only language of the peninsula. Well, of course, there are many other languages like the one I speak, Galician. So if we think about colonization and language, we know that colonization, both, and I'm not speaking about just the past, I'm also speaking about colonization in the present, was an endeavor to control assets, to control the land and the environment, to control labor, with the introduction of gender and family regimes that were alien to the people here in the Philippines or in Asia and Africa, and the construction of the other as infrahuman. So the colonizers could not just come and exploit gold or people or take slaves without the discourse that allowed them to do that. But the discourse was very important, and language was also a very important way of presenting the other as disorganized. I'm sure you're familiar with this Christian myth of the Tower of Babel, which is like a punishment from God. So this is an idea that the colonizers brought, that speaking different languages is chaos and is part of being this alien other. And I like quoting Ngugi, who's an African theoretician, when he says that to control a people's culture is to control their tools of self-definition in relationship to others. The domination of a people's language by the language of the colonizing nations was crucial to the domination of the mental universe of the colonized. So this is happening still today. Introducing colonial languages like English or Spanish in the different areas is still a way of introducing power and displaying power. So we may think that this is some philosophical discussion, but it actually has a very strong material impact. And I always like to bring this summary of different ways in which language hegemony affects those of us who are not speakers of a hegemonic language by birth. So if we think about English, when we say, oh, English is an international language, etc., well, it's also a business. It's a $63 billion business. And imagine who pays the money and who gets the money. So it's a very important material impact, the money that people spend all around the world to learn this language. Of course, there's this epistemological divide. English is supposed to be the language of knowledge, and I can give the example of Galician scientists and researchers. If they publish in Galician, they get less money from the university than if they publish in English. So it's a very obvious material impact that nobody wants to discuss. And of course, now if we think about even taking examples from feminist theory, many times whatever is written in English becomes the theory, and whatever is written in or about other languages becomes like a case study. And one thing that always shocks me is that whenever anybody discusses feminist linguistics, I'm not sure whether you've had any discussion of this kind in your classes at some point, but the whole discussion about how gender is transmitted through language, how we construct gender roles, whether men and women speak differently in social linguistics, they always take American theoreticians to prepare the foundations for the field, and then they add some case studies from Japan or China or wherever. And of course this is quite striking because every language has its own way of representing gender relationship, right? So the way that we take English as the theory, the general theory through which we're going to study all the other languages, is quite problematic and quite obvious in the case of linguistics. But it affects any other field that we look at. And of course, another important material impact for me is that the imposition of these hegemonic languages also delinks communities from their own histories of subversion. I'm sure you have discussed here the different understandings of gender, for example, Native American peoples or First Nations peoples, or pueblos originarios, as they call them in South America. And many times the identities that the hegemonic language creates obliterates this diversity and the history that they have, because that history is also in the different languages that people speak. So I don't want to discuss this in detail. If you want, we can talk about it later. But the way, for example, the Spanish colonizers unified different ways of referring to gender identities in the local communities was a very violent way of unifying this and that into men and women, or even the descriptions of God. So all that has happened through translation, as we will see. And of course, people get excluded from their rights. If you think, we will see, I have the picture now in a minute, but Do you know how many languages are official in the UN? No? We'll see that in a minute. It's actually only like 6. So imagine how many people are excluded from the conversations that take part in international organizations just because they do not speak the hegemonic languages of the institutions. So in the end, this whole structure, this desire for monolingualism and language hegemony, has led us to develop an idea of us as advanced, modern, and we see this in feminist discussions all the time, like Western feminists depicting their other, right? I think that if we look at the pictures, we can tell who is us and who is them in the usual hegemonic discourse very easily. So we are advanced, we're modern, we're developed, we have medicine, progress, etc. We have a modern identity, and even now it's quite ironic that we discuss LGBT issues worldwide as if we in the West had invented them, when in fact most communities around the world already had a very diverse gender understanding, or understanding of sexual orientation, gender identity, and it's only through colonization that they got introduced to the Western ways of seeing those identities. And then we have them who are exotic, backward, and many times sexist and represented as sexist and homophobic. So many times we've seen these pictures and we've heard the comments that go with them. Even in feminist circles in the West, it's quite current that we hear, we have to teach these women elsewhere, the ways of feminism, or people are supposed to know Simone de Beauvoir, even if they live in Afghanistan, and it might be totally irrelevant for their own context. So we're still creating all this, and this is being done through language. So a very good example of this is when we ask about Black feminism, which is in itself critical of these, white Western feminism. Where do you think most Black feminists live? Which continent? Any other guesses? Yeah. Most Black people in the world live in Africa. But when we speak about Black feminism, do we read African theoreticians? Or do we read North American Black scholars? Which is, of course, the same thing for the understanding of civil rights, of racism. So any topic is relevant in its own context. So this discussion is relevant here, but it doesn't mean that it's relevant elsewhere. That is the problem with language hegemony, that it is also imposing an agenda elsewhere and introducing a set of texts, a set of knowledge that you have to know. And the case of Black feminism for me is quite telling. So part of the problem that we have with this has to do with translation and with interpretation. Like, how do we access, for example, we're speaking here from a hegemonic perspective in an Anglophone country, though the language was also introduced through colonization. But we can think, okay, so we read these texts, we do not have access to other texts because they're not available in our language, so we can go to translation and interpreting. That might be the solution. Now, the problem is that translation and interpreting were also used as colonial tools. And here you have the languages of the UN. So the introduction of the Bible, Shakespeare as the most outstanding writer of all times, the treaties. I'm not familiar with the treaties in the US, but I know that, for example, in New Zealand, there's currently a court case about the translation, how the Treaty of Waitangi was translated and how the Maori people gave up sovereignty without being aware that they were doing it. So there's a court case now going on because of the translation, which was done by a priest. It's a long story anyway, I won't tell you all the details, but just for you to have an idea of how important translation was as a colonial tool. And of course this idea of universal knowledge and science. So it was all used, translation was used to promote this agenda. And in feminism, it's also a tool for colonization in many, many cases. And if we look at the translation flows, which was a bit what I was discussing before, we can see that works produced in the West, mainly in English, some in French, with Simone de Beauvoir as the most important example, they get translated into many other languages. However, the works of feminists who are writing in Yoruba, in Galician, or in Tamil, they rarely get translated into English, or into Spanish, or into French. So there is already a violence that's happening in this process to what we call translation flows in feminist theory. Then, of course, we have the issue of patriarchal translation. That's another tool, important tool, that has been used. Like, I won't tell you all the details, but they're fascinating stories of how, for example, The Second Sex was translated into English because the publisher who published it in the US, his wife was in France at the time The Second Sex was published. She saw a book with the word sex in it, which was selling like cookies, and then she wanted to translate this into English. They hired a sexologist, and he did away with half of the text because, of course, it didn't make sense to him. So the book, which is 2 volumes, became 1. And this translation was the only available translation for many years in the whole Anglophone world. As you can imagine, this created a divide between French-speaking and English-speaking feminists. And it was only in the 1980s in Canada, they speak both languages, that translation scholars started investigating what had happened with this translation, that they realized that this kind of violence had been exercised. Unfortunately, this has continued. There are many examples of how patriarchal readings or patriarchal interventions break the connection between feminists across languages. But this is not only done by the patriarchal establishment. When we look at it from a colonial perspective, we also have examples of feminists who have translated works of women from other languages and other cultures, who have also used colonial tools to exoticize their texts, for example, or to, as this Tamil scholar and author C.S. Lakshmi claims, to reduce their cultures to footnotes. So this is also a strategy that's widely used in translation. So how can we make feminist and decolonial translation a tool in this context for polyphonic conversation? So first, I think the most important thing is to challenge this idea of language hegemony. Even if we are monolingual speakers, we have the capacity to start rethinking. Where does our theory come from? Where does our information come from? In which languages? Do we have access to texts from other parts of the world? Are we aware of what is being done, written, or said elsewhere? What gets translated, and by whom? And also, we can look at the strategies that are used for translation. And for me, the most important aspect of all this, as a person who comes from a non-hegemonic language community, is to create links across non-hegemonic communities. So we do not have to speak for the hegemony all the time. We have to speak amongst ourselves. So you may ask, what does this all look like in practice? And so of course, there's a huge body of theory now on feminist translation and decolonial translation. But generally speaking, what feminist translators and interpreters claim first is that we have to be aware of our own position. As I said before, I come from this hinge position. So we have to be aware of what kind of privilege we have or what kind of power structures we're in, and also make it visible. If we're speaking about literature, many feminist and decolonial translators like using introductions of prior texts to explain how they have read the text, so that the reader knows, oh, okay, this is the kind of interventions that were done and why. Of course, you have to be familiar with the gender structures of your source and target languages of cultures and subcultures, and be familiar with the feminist movement languages and debates in both languages that you're using. Because otherwise, that's also something that gets studied a lot in feminist translation circles. Again, there's a delinking of, or we cannot forge alliances if we're not familiar with we cannot tell what's new, what this text is introducing as new concepts, for example, in the feminist movement in that language, and what we already have. So for that, you need to be familiar with the discussions and language that is being used. So I like to use, for this whole process, I like to use the idea of polyphony. If we compare it with monolingualism, with this idea that we all need to speak one language to understand each other in any context, I prefer to think about feminist and decolonial discussions as a space where we have two or more simultaneously but relatively independent melodic lines, so different languages that can be on an equal footing. And of course we have to use different strategies for different texts, and here I have, for example, a translation I did of Angela Carter's short story. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this author, but it's a British author. So in my case, whenever I'm translating from a hegemonic culture, I have no problem in what Lawrence Venuti, a translation scholar, calls domestication, that is erasing the foreign in it, because anyway, you know, this is a hegemonic culture, we're also in Europe, and who cares if I adapt it to our Galician context, because there's no political implication there. But when I'm translating from a non-hegemonic culture, I usually say that my target is indigestion, so that when people read the text, they have to come to terms with what's foreign in it, and they have to realize, oh, it's me as a reader, or the translator is trying to push the reader to make an effort. If you're a white hegemonic European reader in Galician, which is the language I translated to, then I'm trying to push that reader to move towards the other language or the other culture. And in creating polyphonic spaces, as I said before, the most important thing for me is that we speak to one another. And this is, I think, one of the most important things that I do is not so much the writing novels, as Danny was saying, or poetry, but being part of those links. And that can be done through projects such as this one, which is a translation from Tamil into Galician, including also Galician poets working with the translations, or another language in Spain, Basque, where I attended a conference some years ago, and we were also given the chance to speak I was given the chance to speak in Galician because we had a Galician Basque interpreter, and we didn't use Spanish as the common language. Or bringing activists from, in this case, Haiti, and trying to create links across our languages. That's the role that we need to play. Because after all, language diversity is also the key to survival. Like diversity, as we have learned from natural sciences and from living in this planet we're destroying, we know that only if we preserve diversity, we have a chance at survival. And this also affects languages and knowledge. And so I think that for me, as I said, my most important role as a non-hegemonic language feminist is to create spaces to talk across our languages and to find a way to create alliances, to forge alliances with one another. And that's all for me. I hope that you have some questions.
Yes, if anyone has any questions. If anyone has any questions. There we go. If anyone has any questions.
Just out of curiosity, like when you're translating like a non-hegemonic,
Can you speak into it?
like what kind of English like version are you writing it in? Like, is it standard English or are there other vernacular?
Oh, I usually translate into Galician, into my mother tongue, either from English or German, well, some of the European languages I speak, French or Portuguese. And then I work in collaboration with other translators to translate, for example, from Tamil. This is a language I understand and I speak to some extent, but I'm not proficient enough to translate works of literature directly. So I usually work with other people to create the final text, and also with what we call intermediate text. So if there is an English translation, for example, or a translation into a language I understand, I can go back and forth and try to work with the text. So, but in any case, it's a very relevant question. In translation, we always have to think about what the original text brings with it in our reading of it. So sometimes we have to bend the standard a little. And I'm thinking about the translation of Weissek Associé into Galician. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this novel. It's a rewriting of Jane Eyre. And in Jane Eyre, there's this mad woman in the attic who dies at the end of the book. And Jean Rees, who was originally from the Caribbean, she wrote the story of that character, who is a Creole woman. So there are sections of the language in the novel is very important because it defines the characters. Unfortunately, we had a patriarchal and colonial translator translating the text, and that whole setup was destroyed. Many times, like we could not, I'm not sure how we would translate that into Galician because we do not have anything similar to a Creole that can make sense in that literary work. But of course, it forces you to think about the boundaries of your own language whenever you translate. And I think that this is something that feminist and decolonial translators also have to fight against. And in my language in particular, this is a language that didn't have a standard until the 1980s. It was spoken. It was actually, we do not have written texts for 4 centuries. It was only a spoken language. So there was like this obsession, and we still see it very often, to have, everything has to follow the standard because we're trying to preserve the language. It's so important. But many times it's stifling when you're translating literature. So we have to push the boundaries of the standard too. So we're also trying to, change the perception of the language itself in our own community through translation.
I was wondering about like the process of translating. Like, what do you do to isolate yourself, or do you like travel in Europe? Because I know like when you're translating, like you're translating culture as well. So like, what is your process to speak to people? I know you said you collaborate, but like you also like look at spaces and I don't know, like what are your influences?
I think that when we're speaking about literary translation, you're asking, right? Because I also do commercial translation, and that's also gender, that's also coloniality there. But if we're just looking at literary text, I think that you have to be familiar generally with, as I said before, with the debates. If I'm translating a Filipino author, then I have to be familiar with the debates from feminist circles in the Philippines and know, the references that she might be using. And many times, like there's one thing I don't like doing, and I don't think I've ever done it, which is talk to the author if she's alive. Because when I think about it with my author hat on, I think that the author is the person who has the least flexible view of the text. So as a translator, I don't need that. I need to have the widest perspective and then make my choices. So I usually ask people who have read the book, and especially what I call expert readers, for example, critics or people in academia, or just readers who are very proficient in the way they read, to give me their insights. For example, when I translated Angela Carter, there's a Galician author, Emma Pereira, she was also very passionate about Carter. She had all sorts of editions of her works. So I was very curious to know, why is she so important for you? Like, why are you so interested in this author? So this gives me some idea of, okay, here are some aspects that maybe I need to consider. But otherwise, because the patriarchal translation establishment also gives the author and the masculine authority. And an important task of feminist translators and scholars has been to debunk this author authoritas. Because a translation is a reading, it's an interpretation. So this going back to the author to authorize what you're translating is again reinforcing the same power structures, male, female. Like there are many studies about this, how translation theory has used this male-female metaphor to describe the original as the male author and the translator is the subservient female. So yeah, there are many implications also in those categories when we look at translation.
Hi. I don't know to what extent you'll be able to answer this, but like, is this like what you're doing, this like non-hegemonic approach to translation? Do you think that that's like a widespread thing that's happening amongst translators? And if not, I think how do you personally, I guess, stay
hopeful like on this like route, on this like project, because obviously when you're speaking about like hegemony, it's like you're fighting the fight, you know. So like how do you stay hopeful and I guess try to spread this more? Well, I guess through your talks, but yeah, is this like a project that other translators are undergoing?
I always say the translators are a very conservative bunch. So it's a community who tends to be very subservient to norms because they have been trained to do that. However, I also have to say that there's now a large community, both in academia and in practice, who are challenging this kind of framework. So we see that, like, for example, just a few weeks ago, I came to know that there's a new feminist translation association just formed in Argentina. So, you know, it's a group of feminist translators who are getting together and pushing in their own community. And we see that in different spaces. But still, if you look at the larger community, even if you look just, not just feminist approaches, but even things that have to do with languages, it's quite appalling. You know, the discussions, if you look at Spanish language, for example, Facebook groups for professionals, and they're still discussing whether Spanish from Spain is better than Spanish from elsewhere, you know, this kind of really basic discussion that has no awareness of colonial history or why these standards are there and why we need to challenge them. I have to say, however, that in the Galician scenario, the situation is a bit different, and I'm famous, if I can say this, for a very public fight with a publishing house in Galicia. So they have written I wrote an article myself, and you know, if you go to feminist translation scholarly circles, they know my name because of that event, because it's complicated and it was very, very vile back in the day. But to some extent, I'm also sorry that people have this example from Galicia, because my experience is quite the opposite. This was so remarkable because it was the exception, it's not the rule. And I've seen that in Galicia we have several feminist translators who have been working and writing for a long time. Even Rosalia de Castro, the founder of her literature, she also translated, and she was definitely a feminist decolonial translator back in the day in the 19th century. It's amazing what she did when she translated. So we do have, like, there's this idea, oh, there's so much resistance, but actually in our language, that's not precisely the case. And if I compare with Spanish, which is like the hegemonic language closer to us, even if we look at gender-neutral pronouns or, you know, the kind of inclusive language interventions, the Spanish Royal Academy of the Language is totally against it. It's like, speak of the devil. It's like the worst thing that could ever happen, and the world is falling apart if somebody uses gender-neutral language, and they're always vilifying people who do it. In Galicia, the Royal Academy for the Language is for gender-inclusive language. So our history is totally different. The fact that our language was standardized so late also helped us realize that this is a human-made process. So it's quite difficult. Of course, I'm not saying that there aren't people who are sexist and, you know, but it's more difficult to argue when your whole language was kind of constructed, your whole standard was constructed in the 1980s. So if we created a language for pavement, which we didn't have before, why can we not create, you know, other pronouns or other ways of speaking to include people in the language?
I was wondering if you, I mean, I know for me as a Spanish speaker, or broadly speaking Spanish and English, learning a language like Galician opened up sort of, I don't know, different ways of seeing and thinking. I was wondering if there were examples of things like, I guess we're not all going to, like, tomorrow be able to be Tamil. Right, that would be a really hard process. And as you said, they're not being the transition's not happening in the other direction into English. So, I don't know, have there been things that you feel like you learned in doing this kind of work? Like, what are we sort of missing? I guess I don't know, I'm wondering, are there things that you think like we're missing by not reading? Like, what kinds of discourses in politics?
Oh, we're missing so much.
No, I know that.
In my experience, I tend to, like, whenever people ask me, oh, what is your reference reading in feminism? I'm like, I never quote Western feminists because most of them, they bore me, or they do not have much new to say. Of course, you need to have that background. I come from the West, so I need to know the history of that, that theory. But what really brings something interesting to me is understanding how, for example, in the Philippines, this interaction between language and diverse genders and diverse understandings of sexual orientation is still present underneath the whole colonial history. And one thing that I always say is quite remarkable in the way we understand language from a non-hegemonic perspective is that maybe I do not need to speak Basque, which I don't, or Tamil, which I do to some extent, for me to understand the position of feminists in those communities. And in the Tamil case, when we have colleagues coming from Tamil Nadu to Galicia, we immediately understand each other because we have like a patriarchal nationalist system, the Galician one, and they have the Tamil one. We also have a state that is oppressing our community. So it's a very difficult tightrope it's a very difficult situation to navigate. Because as a feminist, you have to be critical of your own culture, but at the same time aware of the oppression of this other culture. So, for example, for Tamil feminists, it's usually the case that they think, oh, you should write in English, you should become Anglophone because that's the identity that will set you free from, the gender or caste patterns of your community. And it's so strong, the point they're making, like, no, we have our own history of resistance. We have our own history of redefining our own gender roles and dealing with it, just like we have in Galicia. So I think this is a very important lesson for everybody to think about. And that's why I think language is so important, even if we just speak one. The fact that we acknowledge that this kind of violence is happening and that we need to be more curious, even if we're monolingual, to be more curious and demand, and establish those relationships and trying to get to know what others are doing in other parts of the world. If we look at it from an environmental perspective, that's also quite obvious. The women who are making the change is not Greta Thunberg, despite everything she does, which is of course valuable. But the teenagers and the girls and women who are really protecting the land and who are struggling are not in the press. We do not hear about them many times because they speak other languages. So that's why we need more people who can mediate and do it in a way that is politically relevant.
We have time for one or two more questions.
I was wondering what language, what other languages you spoke at that.
Yeah, I was going to ask the same thing.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering. People have had experience like another type of knowledge.
So Spanish over here. Yeah, that's something I didn't address, but there's also this myth of multicultural communities or nations or countries, when in fact they're still monolingual, because people who speak other languages, not the majority language, rarely get to hear their language anywhere, except in their own communities. They never read. I imagine it's very difficult if you're a person who has your roots or your family history or background elsewhere, and you live in the U.S. and you never read anything about your country, or when you do something demeaning or prejudiced. It's very difficult to have a connection, also an emotional connection to your background and to the history of the place where you come from or where your family comes from, and have a more diverse view of what's happening there than just what your family gives you. So I think that there's also a fiction there that we need to challenge, and we have to use the opportunity when we have a space in which people are living together and they have different languages. That's the first step. We do not have to travel anywhere to start the process, and just be curious about who is around us and who are the authors or the feminists in their communities, which many times they may not be aware that they have. So just asking the question forces the person to check, what in my language, who are the women who are writing in whatever century, or what are the discussions in that language. I think that especially when we speak about migrant communities, it's very often the case that there's also a lack of connection with this kind of knowledge in the language that you have from your heritage.
Well, I think if no one has any other questions, that's a really beautiful way to seal the deal. But if we could give another round of applause. Thank you all for coming. If you could help stack chairs, that would be greatly appreciated.
Now you're not tell me what was it about?
Yeah, alright. Oh, did you get here a little bit late?
Yeah, because when I read, it's